Excellent. So excited to be here. This is how to recession-proof your job in 2023. Albert, Elisa, and I initially ran this webinar about 6 months ago. How to recession-proof your job search in 2022. And then a couple of weeks ago, we kind of updated that with some interesting new tactics and some new insights and data and things like that. So this is the brand new minted 2023 version. Excited to be with you. So here's the format. I've got a presentation deck that I'll walk through. We've got lots of time for questions. Feel free to use the chat. And there's a Q&A function, of course, that most folks are familiar with. I'll do a screen share. I tend to run these presentations pretty flexibly and relaxed. So you'll see me pop between the deck and then some web browser tabs with some different examples and things like that. Fear not, I will make sure that we share the recording from this webinar afterwards, and we'll also share the presentation slides with the links and everything. So anything that you see me mention or show is going to be sent to you afterwards as well. So don't worry that you have to write it all down or note it all. And I'll probably drop a couple things in the chat as we go along too. So, okay, let me hit the screen share here and we'll get going. And also just a quick heads up, also with us is Elisa, who's a co-lead with myself for the boot camp. Elisa's on mom duty, hanging out with the kiddo, so probably won't be on video or audio too much. I'm sure we've got some working parents in the webinar who can understand that's how it goes sometimes, but we're glad to have Elisa on board as well. So let me hit that screen share, and Elisa, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I was going to say, I just wanted to briefly introduce myself. Joe and I run the boot camp. We are longtime moderators within the Albert's List community group. So really excited to connect with everyone. We keep these very informal. So I'll be manning the chat and also co-presenting. Please feel free to ask any questions or Q&A. We had a really interactive session last week, so hoping we can add value there within this webinar as well as beyond. And please feel free to pop in your LinkedIn. We want everyone to stay connected. And so I'll go ahead and kick that off. And back to you, Joe. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Elisa. Love that. Yeah, great starting point. In the chat box, drop in your LinkedIn profile, get synced in. A lot of folks in the Albert's List community know we are 100% community first. That's just kind of how we roll. Everything around a job search and growing your career, it's all about having a community with you in that process. So make sure to pop your LinkedIn profile into the chat. I'll add mine a little bit later once I'm kind of into the presentation. And we're excited. So I'll just sort of kick that off. By the way, just to kind of orient things, put a 1 in the chat if you're actively job searching and a 2 in the chat if you're keeping an eye out, sort of passively job searching. I'm curious to see, always curious to see what folks are up to. So we got a bunch of 1s, no surprises there. I'm not shocked that you showed up to a webinar on the job search. We've got a couple 2s, excellent. Okay, cool. Yeah, excellent. Oh, good. Okay, love that we've got a good mix. That's great. I'll try to, as we're talking about some of the examples, I'll try to kind of mention a few of the tactical things that will sort of apply to both, but then there'll be some things you can do a little more of if you're, active versus passive and things like that. So yeah, about 50-50 mix. Cool. Usually it's a little heavier on the active job searching. So I love that. We can kind of tag team and hit both angles. So, all right, let's do it. So here's the agenda that we'll be getting into. The strategies are kind of mentioned here. I'm going to, maybe a couple slides per strategy. We'll talk through it. We'll look at a couple of examples. Folks that have been on one of the webinars, or maybe, we're in the job search boot camp. I see a couple familiar faces. What's up? Good to see you. Some of it will be familiar, but we have tried, because we're very value oriented, to make it as useful as possible and as 2023 as possible. And of course, we'll have some time for questions throughout. If I miss any questions at the end, we'll try to dig in and make sure we kind of go back and catch them. So I'm not going to say too much about Albert's List, but we always just, mention for folks who may have happened across this webinar and aren't part of the community, please do join. There's a Facebook group. We do lots of events like this one. We do virtual events like mock interviews and things like that. In fact, on Mondays, right before this webinar, we just had a mock interview. So if you need any practice with stuff like that, there's all kinds of great resources. So excited to have folks. As mentioned, Lisa and I run the job search bootcamp for Albert's List. We've been doing that, gosh, I guess it's about 3 years now. We run that twice a year. At the end of this webinar, I'll give you a very quick, here's how it works in case it's something you want to join, because we do have the next one starting up in about a week. I'm Joe. I run my own coaching business. Before that, I was a marketer, basically working in tech and startups for about a decade. And then Elisa, if you want to say something, feel free to chime in as well. I know you've been a long time Alberts lister.
Yeah, just echoing what Joe said. We're just longtime volunteers within the Alberts List community, moderating the groups, running virtual events. It definitely picked up during COVID because a lot of people were in a period of exploration, trying to understand, like, all the different options there are for them out there. And so just looking to add value where possible, in this session tonight. And my background is in corporate sales. So if you're ever interested in sales and marketing in the tech or healthcare or financial services, capital market space, or just talk shop in any other areas, career resource related, let me know. And I'm happy to connect.
Love that. Yep. Excellent. And then one other thing I'll just say, I always say this really quickly, but Elisa and I've been in the Alberts List community for, I guess, almost a decade now for both of us. So we're pretty serious about this stuff. And, when we say community first, everything that we do around the job search and career growth is really about that. So that's kind of why I always like to mention that piece. So, all right, let's talk recession-proof skills. We've talked a little bit about this in the past, and I know people are kind of thinking about this as the economy shifts. Highlighting recession-proof skills, there's a lot of ways you can go with this, but I always go back to an example that is really relevant, which is data. If you're in a tech or a tech-enabled business, which I think is pretty much everyone at this point, right? There's very few businesses that are not using some type of, tech platform, software, databases, things like that. Data is really where it's all at. And there's actually a lot of stuff in that stack. You don't have to be an expert on data to sort of get the basic picture. One piece is sort of gathering, collecting data. I always use the example of, like, you may actually even have this sort of data skills that you might not be thinking of formally. Like, let's say you work on a customer support team and, you're kind of the go-to person who sets up surveys and collects data and, kind of puts it in the spreadsheet after and things like that. Well, okay, you probably actually have a data skill around gathering and formatting data. Hygiene is another area, and that's, kind of a little bit more into what data analysts do, cleaning up and structuring existing data, making sort of data categorized so that it can work with other data from different databases and tools and apps and things like that. So those are some examples of kind of like the front end. And then on the back end, you've got that, that presentation, analysis, strategy. This is kind of, where it goes into like, how do we actually do something with this? So if you've ever folks who've worked in a startup will definitely recognize this phrase, but it's widely applicable. It's like, how do you make data actionable? That's a highly valuable skill. So being able to kind of present, understand, and make specific recommendations and like actually do something with it is a big deal. And there's also another thing that sort of goes around it, which I think fits the current economy that we're kind of looking at and all the things that are going on, and that's sort of data-proof skills. And so this is an example. I like Hannah Morgan. If you don't know Hannah Morgan, Career Sherpa is sort of the brand. Lots of great stuff on Hannah's blog about, job searching and career progression and things like that. But when you're looking at, sort of recession-proof careers, there are certain things that are just kind of gonna, they're not immune to layoffs, they're not immune to changes, but they're gonna kind of be resilient. Healthcare, people are always gonna need healthcare. That's not gonna suddenly, stop having a demand, right? Other categories vary, federal government, law enforcement, firefighter, things like that tend to be very necessary, right? They're kind of the needed. And so any type of data work in or around those spaces, I kind of mentioned that, like, okay, collecting data, gathering and structuring it, cleaning it, presenting it, making analysis, like data, there's all sorts of data oriented roles. So if you do any of those things, formally or informally, those are really high demand skills. And that puts you, in sort of a good positioning as a job seeker. It's something that I always kind of recommend. Let's see, I always am one of those people. I'm like, how do I get back to my slides? Oh, there we go. Okay, perfect. One sec. tab should do it. Here. I guess I'm not very good with tech and presentation, so I shouldn't put that on the front of my resume. So second example that I think is sort of applicable but interesting because it's changing a lot is remote and hybrid work communication. The reality is that a lot of companies are dealing with this pain point. And if you've been in a meeting where there were some people in a conference room and some people on a Zoom or another, kinds of conferencing call, you've seen that pain sort of work. Like the people in the room are like talking about something that, they're, oh yeah, blah, blah, blah. They're sort of pointing at a board and everyone's kind of like, yeah, I have no idea what you're talking about. Not that that's new, that's certainly happened in the past, but the skill set of sort of making internal communication and tools at work, that's a high value piece. And actually, this is something that I think a lot of companies struggle to articulate a strategy for. So if you've got this skill set, if you're really good at kind of doing things that are hybrid and you just kind of have been doing some of that for your work in your office naturally, that's an opportunity. So here's what that looks like. Not that you have to put this on your resume, but I like to be as practical as possible. So, that first sort of key point is like, okay, how could I show that I have some, chops at, at doing kind of remote or hybrid or flexible stuff. Same thing for that, second and third one kind of, maybe my actual job title is customer support or support lead, but I want to, really focus on the fact that I was, sort of tasked with, figuring out how can we get users to come back or, increase loyalty or increase repeat, purchases if it was e-commerce or something like that. So, and, this can affect both the key points on your resume under roles. It can affect the way you position or describe yourself when someone says, tell me about yourself, or why do you want this job? These are the kinds of things you can do to shift positioning. Okay, let me check the chat real quick and see if we have any questions.
Joe, just objecting. Everyone's wanting like a copy and paste of the chat, which I think Albert is able to do, but I don't know if there's a way to like easily export it out. So unfortunately, like if you want to connect with everyone, hopefully you can kind of just flex the muscle and like click on folks as they're pasting in, or
oh gosh, is that about the LinkedIn, not being able to click through LinkedIn profiles? Is that
everyone's wanting to connect and see if there's a way to do it post session, but I'm just confirming that there isn't a way to do it. Albert has access to the chat, but it comes in as like raw chat data. So probably best to just do it. Yeah, exactly. Probably best, like Eric said, just to click on it in real time.
Yeah, I think it might be something that we'd have to go back into the settings. So we probably can't update it right away for the
Okay, I'm on it. Just Joe, keep going. I'll work on it with Albert. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, yeah, no problem. Good heads up. Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing the links as clickable when people put their LinkedIn profile, but that might be something to quickly troubleshoot with Albert. Yeah, and thanks for the heads up, folks. Sorry about that. I know sometimes Zoom is not always super obvious, but usually once you enable the account, it's a little easier. Okay, yeah, so positioning, and let me make sure, no questions missing here. So strategy 2, which I think a lot of folks are thinking about right now, is sort of like, how do I translate, some of my skills working in tech to government or nonprofits? I'll be really straightforward with you and say this is not something where you can just do it in 20 minutes and you're good to go. It does take some positioning. It can be a challenge. And it's something where, long story short, that bottom key point, I think, is probably the most important one if you're making that transition into government or some other kind of sector that's more complicated, is you really need to find somebody who's sort of done it already, right? Because there's a lot of nuance to those kinds of things. So one of the ways that I position this is, traditional sites like LinkedIn, ZipRecruiter, Indeed, these can be good ways to do research. They can sort of open the door to, organizations like, let's say you want to work in local or state government. Sometimes they post jobs there. So it can be a way to kind of like figure out who's doing what, but most of the time it's a bit more of a niche game. So like USA Jobs is the sort of primary site for federal jobs. Governmentjobs.com has not all, but a pretty significant percentage of state and local jobs on it. And then you get a lot of like industry newsletters, groups, forums, email listservs, and things like that. If you're thinking about government, for example, it's networking is incredibly important. And so being able to find people who are trying to do, made the transition you're trying to do is really important. Same thing with, nonprofits and some other sectors like that. And so being able to do a bit of that networking and outreach and, being able to send a quick message and say, hey, I noticed that you used to work at X and now you're in local government or you're at a nonprofit, would you be open to a quick question or two? I'm trying to make the same kind of transition. So that's where those kinds of, informational interviews come up. There's also a positioning challenge that comes with that. So, for example, I don't think I've ever seen a job description in, government and maybe not even in nonprofits where customer success was the actual role, maybe a little bit if it was more on the software side in the nonprofit world. It's just not a job title or a role that shows up much in those positions. It's kind of been crafted in the tech world. That said, there's lots of stuff that you do in a customer success role that would, very easily translate. You just have to reposition it. And so it's like community outreach training, data analyst, things like that. Those may all be areas where you can reposition your experience. And again, I think networking is sort of the big piece. You kind of want to find out who does the thing well in your vertical, right? So if someone's already made that transition and they're doing a good job of networking and they're sharing jobs and talking about their experience, that person's going to be a really important and useful person to follow and pay attention to. So I also wanted to mention, does anybody know, I'd be curious in the chat, does anybody know Diego Granados? Diego is a product manager at LinkedIn. And Diego's sort of a wizard at a lot of things, but especially at using advanced search in LinkedIn. And again, this one I'll actually pop the link into chat real quickly too. Diego is really awesome. Oh, good. There is someone who recognizes Diego. That's awesome. So you already kind of know the power of what Diego talks about. So this is a post that Diego did about kind of how to find hiring managers who might be hiring right now, which is obviously quite a powerful thing to do. And I won't make you read the whole thing here, but essentially he kind of gives you two parts. One is sort of how to filter and find people. And then one is, how to actually send a quick message. And he has kind of a template that he recommends. But this is a really good thing to add too, is a lot of people don't really use LinkedIn for search. Let's see. Let's just do hiring a product manager. Let's see. I'll probably need to range that a little. LinkedIn search is quite powerful. It's probably not as sort of built up. Oh yeah, well, here you go. Here's one right here, right off the bat without even ranging it. So Eric, who's I believe someone that I follow, is hiring a business information management specialist. Okay, hybrid, not eligible for 100% remote. Anyway, how you do it is you put in your, in your title or the phrase you're looking for. You can range it by posts, and then bingo, you've got sort of a list of stuff, and you can subcategorize it. Like one thing that people know is like it's good if you can. It's not like you have to, but it's good if you can apply to something relatively recent. If it's more than 2, 3, 4 weeks old, it might still be useful, but a lot of times you're looking for something in the past week, but past month still works too. So that's another thing you can do. There's a lot of sort of powerful advanced search things that you can do. If one of your targets is a bigger company, you can actually look for the specific company. So you could look for that phrase, hiring a product manager, and you're looking for people who've said that thing, that phrase, and they're at Google. Oh, Google just lays people off. So let's try something else. I know most of big tech has laid people off recently, but we'll just throw it in there for kicks. So that will get you, I might need to, I'll just drop it down to this phrase for now and see what we get. Past month, someone in Microsoft. Well, that doesn't seem logical. Somebody from Microsoft must have said something about hiring. Well, anyways, I won't go too deep, but you can play with that, with those filters, and you can reset them, and then it kind of sends you back. So it's kind of a little bit like Google search. You kind of have to play with it a little bit to get successful stuff. But, ultimately you can find people who are hiring right now or just posted about it, which is kind of cool. And that's, certainly a useful exercise in general. I would say if you haven't played with LinkedIn's advanced search, take some time to do it. It's totally worth finding people and companies and jobs and things like that. And this is an extra way to kind of like, in addition to waiting for jobs to show up and, then getting notifications, this is another way to kind of be more proactive. And so one of the things that I recommend for folks is to actually use Diego's template. Put that in your calendar twice a week, 30 minutes. Even if you're just passively job searching, I know we kind of are about 50-50 from what people were talking about in the chat. That's a great way to find people and brands that are growing and hiring and things like that. Kind of a good habit. So even if it's just 30 minutes, once, twice a week, that can be quite useful. So let's see. I don't know if we've solved the chat saving, but hopefully. And yes, Albert, we could definitely do an encore to the webinar if we need to. So that was sort of about Diego. And Diego has a few templates, by the way, that he does. So take a look at his featured posts, because there's lots of good stuff in there that's quite helpful. So strategy number 3, this is a little bit of a phrase from my days as a marketer. You're kind of looking for riches in the niches, which is sort of a fancy way of saying, be specific, but not too specific. And so I like this example, and I've used it in the past, but there's many others that you could use. Series B social impact startups with no layoffs. Ideally, you start to have a few kinds of goal places, workplaces that you want to work and companies that you want to follow. I'm always a little like, I totally get it when people are like, well, I just want a job and I'll work anywhere. That's not a very specific target. And so the more you can sort of optimize where you're trying to go, but not be too specific, the better chance you'll have of being able to position yourself for that kind of role. And the better chance you'll have of actually getting in the door and interviewing, et cetera. So that's kind of why I recommend sort of being in that middle range. And if you can kind of think about it a little bit like, Google, let's say that you're, trying to find, I don't know, sports events in the Bay Area, and you Google sports events Bay Area. Well, good luck. I mean, that's probably a lot of stuff, right? It's kind of hard to sort through that. But let's say you're interested in soccer. Let's say you're interested in, I don't know, adult rec league soccer. It's not pro, but you want to get back in there and kind of, play a sport you haven't played in a bunch of years. That's more specific. So the more specific you can be, the more relevant you can be in terms of getting those examples, the better sort of goals you're going to get. And in fact, it's not that hard to do. And I like the, I think I already have that open. Let's see here. Example. There we go. I like this example from Shani Benzer. I don't know if anybody follows Shani, but Shani has some great stuff on LinkedIn. Shani's the CMO at Crunchbase. And so, as a good sort of CMO, she semi-regularly posts about how to use the database. And in fact, for job seekers, she has 2 or 3 posts that are featured on her profile. This one's about 6 months old, but there's I think a couple more that are within the last, 3 to 6 weeks to have some other extra tips. But you can actually find that social impact startup. You can filter to look at, what their last funding raise was. If they got a Series B, you can see if they reported any layoffs. As she notes, it's not like a perfect system, but you can sort of, check that. And so Crunchbase has information on about 2.5, maybe 3 million companies, I think. So it's a pretty comprehensive database. And so, you can sort of do that searching to go range up and down, kind of similar to LinkedIn's advanced search, right? Where you're trying to find that sweet spot. And so these are, companies and different verticals and things like that you can look for and then follow, which is really useful. And I definitely recommend, playing with that a little bit, because it's something where you're going to find your own style of how to do it. I mean, here's the link to that particular post from Shani, and that'll be in the presentation or the deck as well. Everything that's sort of linked that I popped open is there as well. Oh, and perfect. Thanks, Tammy, for adding in Shani's profile. But I would recommend, when you're looking at kind of the top databases, I think Crunchbase for sure is sort of a must. LinkedIn advanced search, definitely. A third one that I really like lately is one called Yield Giving. I think a few people may have seen me talk about it, but Yield Giving has about 1,600, social impact orgs that were funded by Mackenzie Scott. And so it's a really cool and very easy to search database. I'll show it to you here. I should probably drop this in chat because I'm not sure this one's in the deck. here we go. Yeah. And then Tammy, you asked, what about Glassdoor? I'm not really a huge fan of the reviews sites, I think, and the reason is I think they can give you some context, but those are essentially the business model of Glassdoor and these other review sites really are to the benefit of the employer. And so, I tend to favor things where, even though on LinkedIn you've got, still owned by the company as a profile, they're not necessarily automatically paying LinkedIn for that profile. It's free versus like a Glassdoor where it's kind of tied to your reviews and things like that. So, there's a more complicated, explanation of that. But in general, I tend to find those profiles for companies a little less useful on Glassdoor, but that doesn't mean that you can't use it for research as well. I think those are definitely worth experimenting with for sure. This is that yield giving database. You can actually see different focus areas. You got geography, so you can range it by US, global, et cetera. And again, this one's for social impact because that's really kind of the main priority of Mackenzie Scott's. I don't even know if it's officially a foundation, but they give away quite a bit of cash. And if you're not familiar with Mackenzie Scott and kind of the process she's been giving away billions for the last couple of years and is going to continue to do that for quite some time. Mackenzie Scott being one of the original investors at Amazon and a former partner for Jeff Bezos, who's the founder over there. So really cool. And I mean, this is sort of interesting because the two sort of extra bits of context about yield giving are, one, these are pre-screened orgs. Yield giving actually screens orgs to make sure that they have a strong enough organizational and operational model and finance model to handle a cash infusion. I don't know what that process is like exactly, but she has written about it a little bit in the essays and has talked about it online. And then in some cases, you can actually see the dollar amount. So I'm not, I don't think it's a perfect, well, this organization's never going to, do any layoffs. But, if you look at it and you're like, okay, I'm interested in maybe, working at one of these orgs and they got, $13 million a year ago or 2 years ago, odds are pretty good that they're not going to be immediately laying people off. And, I think the other thing that's sort of in effect with a lot of these orgs is now that they have a little more, financial kind of chunk of change behind them to keep them going and reinforce them, they probably do, have a desire to add more tech skills, right? So this is sort of a place that you could, especially if you're coming from tech or, maybe you're tech adjacent, you kind of want to refocus your efforts into social impact. This is another database you can use for that purpose too. Yeah, so it's cool. Oh yeah, and then Monica mentioned Wellfound, which used to be AngelList. Yep, that's definitely, I think that's probably in my top 5. Up there close to Crunchbase. Pretty similar model. A little more startup oriented, I think, in general, but definitely worth keeping an eye on. And Wellfound, which used to be AngelList, tends to have salary transparency in the it's not, I don't think it's mandated, but you tend to be able to see salary transparency, and it's kind of an expectation for most of the jobs posted there too, which is cool. So and I'm a big fan of salary transparency. I think that's something that kind of levels the playing field in a lot of cases. So, okay, cool. So let me pop back here. I'll do the screen. Got that. I sort of mentioned a couple of additional research tools here. There's a lot of ways you can, pay attention to what people are up to in terms of different sectors. You can browse news releases on one of the wire sites like, PR Newswire, which is linked here, or Business Wire. If there's a particular, product type, whether you're really into e-commerce or CPGs, maybe you're really into, ed tech startups, things like that. There's ways to kind of keep track. And most of these have some type of like daily digest email you can sign up for, right? So you can sort of pay attention to certain verticals and, see who's growing, who's launching a new product. Sometimes they announce, yeah, we're launching the beta version and we've already got 5,000 paying customers. Maybe they even tell you how much revenue they've already got. Okay, cool. So this product is doing good. That might be a place where I want to position myself or go after an opportunity on that team. And then, public company earnings tools are another good way to do it. I won't go super deep into public company earnings because I used to be a business journalist and, I could talk about that forever. It's interesting. But if you are considering working at a huge public company and you're interested, You don't have to be an expert, but go look at the earnings, quarterly earnings and the annual earnings. That's the 10K, I think, is the annual, and 10Q is the quarterly. Might be the other way around. Can't remember right off the bat. Feel free to put it in chat if you do know. But what I'm trying to say is essentially with publicly listed companies, you can figure out if they're doing well or not. And, not 100% perfection, but you can often figure out which parts of the company are doing well. So, if you want to work at a really big company, a Target, maybe a Citibank or something like that, figure out which part of the company is growing and doing well and is supporting the revenue growth, and, go for that rather than a legacy product and things like that too. And then you can also use other sort of, I mentioned Google Alerts and sort of the process, a little bit of kind of narrowing down and checking stuff. But that's another way to kind of go after things that you're really interested in and sort of finding that niche of, the right spot. There's a lot of ways I could go into that. I won't. It could get really granular, but just know that these kinds of resources exist. And I think if you're especially going back to that topic of sort of recession-proof, and particularly for people who put that too in the chat, because you're kind of like keeping an eye on the situation, but you're not actively job searching, you should be aware of and keep a watch list of orgs that are really of interest to you, and maybe places that you would want to work in the future. So, yeah. So strategy number 4, I don't think anyone's going to be shocked by this one. This is not new. It's sort of networking, right? Keeping the fires warm. We talk about this a lot in the job search bootcamp, and I'll kind of do a quick run through at the very end of this webinar just to give you a heads up in case you are interested in joining us when we start sort of the next cohort next week. But networking, I think, is something that people, I think people have vastly different understandings of it, but this is sort of my primer for how to do it. Keep the asks small, make sure to give and get, right? Don't be the person who just is like, I haven't seen you in, 5 years or 10 years. Hey, can I book your whole Saturday? And I'd like you to pay for dinner while we're doing it. Like, don't be that person, right? Be the person who's gracious and, keeps things small and kind of builds that relationship over time. And I really look at it, like, for me, the way I always ground that is it's a conversation. Like, even before you come in the room, even before you got here to this webinar, you had a life, you have things you're doing, you're, maybe some of you just got off work, some of you are just finishing some job searching activities, maybe you were hanging out with a friend, maybe you were watching some Netflix, like, hey, right on, that's awesome. What's your favorite show on Netflix? Oh, cool, yeah, I just watching that too. That's what a conversation is like, right? We're not just treating people as these transactional objects. And so that's sort of the theory that I think, goes into it. And it's like, if you don't love that process, I know not everybody loves networking. I get that. And especially for introverted folks, it can be kind of scary and hard. But you got to practice, right? Warm it up, keep it small, easy, achievable, practice, get that muscle going. And I think, one of the sort of hidden recession-proof things is don't ever let your network of folks who know you not know what you're up to and what you're looking for. Like, be consistent. And so, like, just to give you a very small example, if you're, your uncle's favorite person, that they work at or they go to the gym with, they play racquetball. I don't know if that's a good example or not. I don't have that particular contact, but perhaps you do. If that person works in financial services and is really savvy, make sure that you've communicated to your uncle, like, hey, just is it okay if I send you a quick note with like 2 or 3 sentences about what I'm looking for in case, you run into so-and-so. Yeah, go for it. That's easy. You send me an email or, text me or whatever. Like, don't neglect your network. Make sure people know what you're doing and what you're looking for. Keep it short and sweet. Position yourself really well. And people are happy to keep an eye out. So I mentioned also, kind of in the networking aspect, I think I have this open, but I'm going to reopen it just in case I'm missing it. Oh, there we go. Let's see here. Close a couple tabs because I'm that person with 80 million tabs open at all times. There we go. Okay, perfect. I did have it open. So this is a set of the materials that we use for the 8 Weeks to Employ Job Search Bootcamp. Some folks have seen this if you went through that in the past. This is a set of materials that are open sourced, which means, and I'll just drop them right in the chat for you. I think Albert always makes fun of me a little bit. He's like, you're just going to give away all this stuff. I'm like, yeah, absolutely. We're going to give this stuff away. This is stuff that we want you to have to level up your career and have the ability to start doing some of these networking activities. this is from 3 years of running the boot camp, and before that, from I would say 5 years of Albert's sort of wisdom as a career, kind of community leader and a job seeker. Like, the way we run the boot camp is very much oriented towards knowledge and practical experience. It comes from years of experience, and so all of the tools here are really sort of part of that process. And then we run in the boot camp, we run that as like an 8-week process. And, there's peers, you've got a cohort, accountability, things like that can really help with that process too. But all of these things are sort of available to you as open source materials. And so I just wanted to briefly mention it so you can take a peek at it. There's some outreach templates for these different kinds of scenarios. You can copy them and use them in pretty much any way you want. Everybody's voice is a little bit different, so please make sure to edit it to fit your own. But there's a little bit more information in this particular doc about sort of the theory of small asks, and there's a bunch of sort of examples here. So if you ever feel like, yeah, I haven't networked in a while, I feel kind of weird, maybe you don't even like that title. I'm not a big fan of the word networking. It always feels a little, but it's a conversation. And so this has some great examples about how to open that conversation or keep it going. And in fact, I would say, here's the example of small asks. This is like if you were reaching out to a potential future coworker. I had a conversation one day in the DMs, and I, copy and pasted it here, and I anonymized it because I didn't want to, put anybody on the spot. But this is like an actual conversation that happened in the DMs. And it's just like an example of how you can stay in touch. And so it can be a very, very small ask, that you can sort of employ to start the relationship. There's some very good practical stuff in here. So I won't go too deep on that, but just take a look at it. If you haven't seen this doc, go take a peek. It's quite useful. And there's some other stuff in here too, which we'll sort of talk about in a bit, including an interview prep template and things like that. So, let me check the chat to make sure. Monica said, when I was first learning the network, one of my mentors asked me about a time I'd helped someone and how I felt afterward. Oh, I love that. Yes. What I really like about that example, Monica, is that one of the reasons to keep the ask small and sort of maintain relevancy is that we like being asked questions, so like the example that I just showed in the screen was like reaching out to a potential future coworker. Like, if you look at that person's profile and you're like, oh, wow, that's cool. They got that certification, or, oh, wow, they also used to be in a different industry and now they're doing, marketing or sales or support or whatever. Then you message them and say, hey, would you be open to a quick question? I noticed you did this and I'm trying to do a similar thing. Like, that relevancy, and just keeping the ask small. Most people are going to be like, yeah, cool. That's thanks. I'd be happy to answer that question. You took the time to ask a good question, right? And so I think we want to feel good about that, right? We want to connect with people. And all of that doesn't mean that you're going to get an answer to every DM or email that you send, right? Some people are never going to respond because they don't really use LinkedIn, or they're just overworked, they're busy, or life, or whatever. And that's okay. We have to, as job seekers, we have to kind of, and networkers in general, we have to just kind of like accept that, the world doesn't go according to the way we want it to. And it might feel like rejection, but that's okay. It's fine. But we want to connect with people in an authentic way. So I really like that point that you made, Monica. That's a good one. And I completely agree. If people really do, they're happy to help as long as you don't ask them for hey, can you write a novel for me this weekend? Because I need to finish it, to submit to my publisher. Like, okay, you got to keep your asks kind of polite. But most people, if you keep the ask small, they will be happy to help. And by the way, I'm just going to give you my absolute pro tip. This is one of the ways that I'm able to network, not because I'm good at networking, just something I learned is I actually ask if it's okay if I ask something. That's how respectful I prioritize being. So in a lot of cases, if you're on the other end, I'm like, hey, Albert, would it be okay if I ask you a quick question? I didn't want to drop one here. I want to be respectful. And Albert's like, yeah, you're asking, is it okay if you ask a small question? Go for it. Like, most people, if you keep it small, are happy to do that. And I love that point that, you made too, Albert, about community. Like, the whole point is for people to be in jobs and on teams that they feel good about. Like we know this job search process is hard. We kind of know it inside and out at this point, but the point is to get you a job. Like that's what we cheer for when Elisa and Albert and the other, community moderators and I, like, that's what when you get a job, we're like, yes, that's the win, obviously I get kind of dorky and excited about it, but that's the whole point. You deserve to be in a work environment where people respect and appreciate you. So, and I could say that all day, that's what we're here for. It's community first. We're super, super, super serious about that. So, okay, perfect.
Jill, real quick,
Yeah,
let me just add one thing. I know we're all talk and seriousness here, which the job search process should be, but I think I always find that when there's like big layoffs, there's like huge activity shifts in LinkedIn. Like people are all of a sudden active and posting more. And then once they find their job, they kind of, settle in and then it kind of becomes quiet again. And ideally, like the way networking is supposed to be, I try to do this. I've, had to like shift a little bit to prioritize family. But before I tried to stay active on the platform and also check in with people. Like holidays is kind of a soft in, but it like people appreciate when you're just like, Joe, happy Thanksgiving. Like I wanted to share, like, this is what's been going on with me the past couple of months. And then people kind of reciprocate that energy, right? Because your connections with them on LinkedIn, but you want to treat them like your friend. Because that's kind of what creates that camaraderie of like when it is time for you to ask them for something, it's like a friend asking you for a favor versus like, okay, this is extra work that like an acquaintance is now asking me online. Yeah. So so that's 2 points there. Just like network regularly, use holidays to your advantage. And if people don't respond, it doesn't mean they're not interested. It just means they're busy with their day too. So if it's a connection where you're asking for help, never hurts to ask again. Maybe they just missed it. And also just when you do find the dream role, don't just go away from the platform. Like I use LinkedIn a lot, so that's kind of the primary focus for us, but any networks that you're connected in, just continue to stay active. Because I think that kind of builds your runway for like your next opportunity, right? So.
Yep. Love that. I think that's really essential. And I think everything that you said, it really highlights, it reinforces the importance of treating it as a conversation. It's not a transaction. And I think that when you do that and you keep things kind of small and conversational and consistent, you're actually signaling to your potential future boss, your potential future coworker, your potential future referral, you're signaling, you're saying, look, I'm going to keep showing up. Like, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad you're here. Like, I'm going to keep being around. I'm not just going to be here when I want something or need something. And, that's a gracious thing to do as a person. And so we want to refer people like that. We want to hire people like that. We will tell people about those experiences. Oh, who'd be great for this? I was just chatting with him a couple of weeks ago about X, Y. Like, that's the kind of, connection that you want to foster. So I think that's a great point, Lisa. And I think the other thing too is like, keeping the asks and the conversation small and concrete. It helps you. It's less stressful for you, whether you're an active or a passive job seeker, right? It's an easier way to kind of use networking. And don't worry if you drop the conversation. Look, if this happens to me all the time, and I'll just tell you my go-to, like, because I forget, I'm like, oh gosh, I didn't message that person back. And then when I think of, oh yeah, okay, I forgot about that. Then I just message them and say, oh, hey, oops, looks like I dropped the message. Like, thanks for bearing with me. And then I open the conversation back up. Like if they asked a question, I'm like, I'm so glad you asked that. Like, I thought more about that. And here's the thing I was noticing, or here's a person or an organization that's really cool that does that thing. Like, just pick the conversation back up, right? Like we all do this with our, with our friends and our family. Like, we forget to answer our sister's text, and then we're like, oh shit, I should probably answer that. And then you just treat them, with respect and warmness, right? So just try to keep that kind of conversational vibe going. So I think that's, keep that consistency is really helpful. Okay, so strategy number 5, and let me time check. Oh, not doing too bad. We got about 12 minutes before the top of the hour. Perfect. I run long. Elisa knows this. I'm one of those people like, I'll just go on forever. So strategy number 5 is create a repeatable job search. This one's not going to blow your mind. I think we all kind of know, like, okay, I should be organizing my search in a particular way. And I just want to show you sort of 2 things really quickly that can help you do that. And I would be curious to hear, how do you feel, like, if you want to put it in chat, how do you feel about your job search? Do you feel organized? Like, put a thing in the chat that's like, yes, I feel organized, or nah, or maybe kind of, because I'd be curious to see, where people are at. Organizing, your job search is not something that you just do in a minute. You have to try some different things. And so this doc is one of the things that we use with the boot camp. It's sort of how to structure your job search in stages. And yours is going to be different. By the way, you can, if you're not super familiar, you can make a copy of anything that you want that's in the, the bootcamp open source materials. So you can set up your own Google Doc and then just change it and edit it to fit your needs. It's a templatized piece. But essentially, this is sort of trying to help people think about their job search in stages, because the more that you think about it in stages, the better, you can kind of optimize. And I always tell people this, like, a great example is, people are like, is my resume and application materials, like, are they good? Are they positioned correctly? And the answer for me is, well, are you getting interviews for the job titles and roles that you want? And if the answer is yes, then they're fine. If it's working, then you're not up, you're not, maybe, let's see, where we're stage 3, then you're doing a good job here in stage 3, right? Your materials are fine. Your job is probably to focus more on interview prep, right, at that point. So it's about kind of structuring it in stages so that you can really be focused and effective. And let me take a peek. Yes, we've got someone who's like wildly, I love how the 2 answers from Anne and Susanna were like insanely organized and very disorganized. I actually relate to both of those things entirely. I feel like some days I'm wildly organized and other days I'm like, I can't prioritize at all. So, don't feel bad if you feel like you're sort of all the things. That's very normal. And I like Monica's comment too about, using Hunter and things like that. There are different kinds of browser extensions that you can use. I really like, this is the second thing I was going to mention. I really like Selena Mendoza's Airtable template. Everybody does it a little different, but I would recommend, if you sort of have a process or not really, go to the template, the Airtable tracker that Selena created. You can open it and make a copy and sort of do whatever you want. But the way that she thinks about it, because of course Selena is a product management, pro and a product leader now, so she's very organized, as one would expect. But the way that she structures it is really, really good. And you can kind of see a little bit of it. I won't go super deep, but she's got sort of the staging, right? Recruiter screen, let's see, app viewed, resume downloaded, recruiter screen, casual chat, second interview. I mean, look at the granularity of that staging, so that she can, for herself, I imagine, put on her calendar, like, okay, Tuesday for 1.5 hours, I'm going to follow up on all of the interviews where the app was viewed or the resume is downloaded. That means somebody looked at it. So it might be worth, messaging that person, doing a little bit of that extra kind of cold outreach, because I know that I'm in the mix. Maybe they're considering interviewing me. Like, I'm not saying that's an exact match, but like, that's the way you can kind of make it actionable when you put it into stages. And that's the whole point of a structure like this, is to focus yourself and make sure that you're optimizing for where you're at. If you're getting a bunch of those 30-minute recruiter screens, but you're not moving to the full interview, like with the hiring manager or a panel, then you need to do something with your interview prep, right? You don't need to go back and change your resume. You need to optimize for where you're at in the stage and the process. And of course, you go through both, you do waves. And I think we can all relate to that. It's not like a linear process where you're just at the bottom of the funnel. Maybe you end up with one opportunity and you're like, I should probably add more to the top of the funnel. So you go back up and you do more applications. I mean, it's a bit of a flexible process, but the staging is to help you structure that. And I think Selena's Airtable template is sort of a really nice example of how to do that. Let me take a peek at chat here really quick. Oh, Susanna asked, what tool is it that notifies you when they download your resume? This kind of depends on, some applicant tracking software shows that. So if you have a login, I want to say, like, as an example, Warner Brothers has their own, it might be like a gray label, I'm not entirely sure, but they have their own, kind of applicant profile system, like a lot of big companies, and you can actually see if your app was viewed. So sometimes in the actual software, it'll tell you, oh, your app was viewed, or downloaded, or resume downloaded, things like that. It does vary a lot, based on the software and things like that. So, and I think, does anyone know, if you do put it in chat, does LinkedIn show you if someone viewed or downloaded your application or resume? I don't think they do, but I'm trying to remember. Oh, Premium does. Okay. Amanda says LinkedIn Premium does show you that. Yeah, that makes sense. That's what I'm thinking of. So yeah, some things, you can kind of see, and actually that makes sense, because if you look at the example that of that screenshot that Selena has, she's got that tag for applied on LinkedIn and being able to see app was viewed versus resume downloaded, things like that. So there is that. I don't consider that to be super highly important signal, because sometimes job application or job descriptions on LinkedIn get thousands of applications, 200, 300, 500, et cetera. So it's not necessarily a super strong signal, but it's stronger than nothing, and it allows you to message the recruiter or the person and see, what's what. So it's an opportunity. So, and some good notes on that in the chat too. Okay, so that's to track that. Let me just really quickly. So last but not least, and by the way, I think when you're organizing your search, this is the part that no one can tell you, like, it's your set of habits. And so what works for one person won't work for someone else, right? Like, I'm a very flexible, prioritized person. I create a list at the beginning of each day with 3 to 5 things that I want to do. Other people are like, I got to calendar it, it has to be an hour at this time because I have life, family, other things going on. So, just note that however you organize your search, it's really important to keep experimenting and sort of testing to see what works for you. It's going to be different for each person based on your habits. Okay, so last but not least, I just wanted to very quickly run through, we've mentioned the bootcamp a couple of times. Albert or Lisa, if you want to pop that Eventbrite link back in there, go for it. This is just the process that we naturally came to. Albert kind of devised this a bunch of years ago, and then we refined it as we were going through it, and then we kind of turned it into the bootcamp 3 years ago. And it's really just about sort of like sequencing the process for success, like optimizing your time and your energy. And so the way that we always run it is like, we start with, what's your positioning? What roles do you want to go for? What are the skill sets and passions that you most want to focus on? How do you sort of dial in where you're going? And then the second part is, mastering fundamentals, right? That's just sort of like positioning your materials, rewriting, and just getting yourself like, optimized for the job titles and things like that. And then we mix in that networking piece, because by that point you're, applying and you're kind of reaching out to people and things like that. Then there's sort of that interviewing component, which is, really about sort of message match and making sure that you're reading the room and things like that. We do talk a lot about like positioning as you get further into the job search. I can tell you, I've had, I want to say 3 or 4 conversations in the last week with folks who, like, they had most of the information, they just needed to structure it. And it was mostly about, what is this team trying to do? Where does this role fit into that? And what are, as Albert talks a lot about, when we talk about interviewing, and I think Albert's running a separate interview workshop that's coming up soon. So, tap him for that. I don't know if that's set up, if that's officially opened yet or not, but if not, Albert's an expert interviewer, and you should reach out to him about that too, because it's very cool. But, a lot of it is about mitigating risk and just like reading the room and understanding the context across the table and making sure that they understand that you get it, right? That you'd be able to kind of jump in and be able to be functioning in that environment. And so that's that navigating change, building credibility. And then we always wrap it up with sort of the more traditional, like, how do you position yourself for, an offer and negotiating, different things that you want, benefits, salary, that kind of thing. And so that's sort of why we use that 8-week model. It's sort of tried and true. Some of it seems obvious. Some of it is actually quite unique and interesting and a little bit different. But we run that process really to make sure that, that job seekers are able to be successful. And the boot camp's really about like having a set of peers and a cohort. A lot of people appreciate that accountability because you've got a group to report back to. We run that. There's a call once a week for 8 weeks. We run a LinkedIn group chat, with the cohort throughout the week. So we kind of keep in touch. Elisa and I use a lot of like voice notes and email, and I use a lot of Looms. I'm sort of famous for doing the Loom screen share stuff where I break down how to look at the org and understand the team structure and things like that. So we take a very hands-on focus to the boot camp. It's very sort of like, we try to make sure that it works for each person, as best as can. So let's see. Okay, let me check the chat here. Jerry asked a question about Facebook. I'll let Albert field that one. I'm not sure, but I have had to do that where I set up a new Facebook profile. So that may be an option, probably under a new email. Yeah, that's frustrating. Okay, so we've got like, a minute left, but we could hang around for another 5 minutes and kind of check in and see what questions you have. How are folks feeling about your job search? Are you feeling really good, not so good? I'm curious to see in the chat, because this is something where we're always trying to kind of pay attention to how folks are feeling. And let me see here. I'll drop the link to the Eventbrite as well, just so you have that. That boot camp starts next week, by the way. I mentioned that. Let me open that really quick. Okay, we've got some folks who
Got a
are...
lot of folks that are I'll just put it as neutral feelings to keep us kind of above board. But yeah, like just to the question about cover letters, I feel like they're not super helpful, but nowadays I feel like there's a lot of like clarity on like, yes, it's required, and no, it isn't required. For some jobs, it still is. I find for like small, medium-sized businesses, it's really helpful because then you can stand out and make an impression. But for the larger enterprise companies, you have to make it past the ATS first. So I would just focus on making sure like your resume is super sharp. I know the folks at One Salting, they've got like a really cool AI built one that was worth checking out. In the bootcamp, we'll also recommend a couple of other resources and have one of our speakers do a live workshop on it. I would say focusing more on resume building is the best. And then for our friend Hunter who said Chat GPT for the win, that's definitely in the mix. I want to throw in Bard as a potential one when it's launched. That could be something to check out. I hear Microsoft is debuting their own OpenAI, so a lot of options here.
Yeah, agreed.
I know Anne was asking Albert,
yeah.
how do you handle when an org specifically requests them? In the boot camp, we actually have templates that we go through that make it really quick and easy for you to, like you said, quote unquote, check that box, but still stand out. So if you do need to create one, we have it pretty dialed in.
Yeah, there's a stack of stuff that we walk through and kind of help people customize it, but it's in that open source folder under resume and cover letter templates. This is, I think the cover letter thing, it's a good question. I think it's evolved. And the answer is it totally depends on the org. The way that I approach it, and this is a template that I've used and had other people use quite a bit. Your goal is to be clear about your positioning and where you're at and what you're doing. Your goal is to show that you get what the organization or the team is doing, that you're excited about it, that you've got some experience at doing that kind of thing. This is sort of classic marketer, your message matching, and then you're trying to show some soft skills. And so I'm sort of showing all that to say that I think the answer to our cover letter's dead is it doesn't matter. You're going to have to introduce yourself somehow. And so whether it's a formal cover letter or a quick note via email, or there's a box on the, the applicant software where it's like include a cover letter or message, include something for sure, and do a little bit of that kind of message matching approach. It doesn't need to be a super formal cover letter, although there are, if you apply to a job and it says, please provide a detailed cover letter and answer these 4 questions, then you should do that, right? Follow instructions. And, there are some kinds of things like in government and things like that where the format's a little more traditional, and that's totally cool. Try to follow the instructions as much as you can. If there's not clarity, then just make a very short introduction message / cover letter and include that, right? You don't have to go crazy. That's sort of the approach that I recommend. I think that typically, works. If you are applying to a senior level, role, you may want to consider investing a little bit more. But I got to tell you, I still think it's just an introduction. Except in highly regulated and governmental situations where they're not really allowed to have any communication with you outside of that initial application and then a very specific traditional interview process. Like if it's that case, then you should, put a little more into it. But outside of that, you're really just opening the conversation. And so you don't need to, sell them 110% in the first communication. That's typically the case. So I don't see any reason to not at least have a couple on hand that you can use. So cool. Oh my gosh, some really nice things from some folks who've been in the boot camp. Excellent. We love it. And I'm not really a hard sell kind of person. So the one thing I will say is the boot camp works. We advance people. Our job is to accelerate it because we want you to get a job. That's it. If you want to do that in a cohort with a good handful of other folks who are really there for accountability and to move fast and to, get your skills moving and, warm up networking if you need that, get your materials, tuned up in position if you need that, get your interview prep going if you need that, whatever the case might be, we're super flexible about that process. And we run the bootcamp for that reason. So I'm not going to give you a hard sell, but let me just be real with you. It works. We do it because it works. And we're really passionate about folks being successful and getting to a place where they want to be. So I'll drop the link back to that as well. And there's a question about pricing too. It ranges. There's a couple versions. If you need a little extra help, like positioning, kind of writing your materials and things like that, we have a premium version that allows you to do that part. Kind of depends on what your needs are. And if you have questions about that, you can message Elisa or I, and we'll try to kind of be like, okay, that sounds like you're fine for the basic version, or, oh, it sounds like you could probably use a bit more hands-on to you're switching industries or careers. Okay, the premium might benefit you because you're going to need to reposition. So we'll try to be as straightforward and honest about that as possible, and make sure that you're recommended to the one that's going to be most useful to you. So I think that's kind of it. That boot camp starts next Monday, the 13th, same time. Actually, we run it at 6 p.m. Pacific every Monday. So, okay, I'm going to scan the chat, and Elisa, feel free to chime in if I missed anything. I just want to make sure I got all the questions before we wrap it up here. Lots of really good questions. Yes, love that.
I don't know, Albert, if you want to kick in, how does one save the chat with all these great links? That's our love.
Did we miss you?
No. I was just saying, the fabulous Tammy's asking, how does one save the chat with all the links? But Albert, maybe you can surface that.
So you're both hosts too. What you can do is you can click on those three dots and it says save chat. So you have actually